The impulse to seek validation is one of the most subtle yet powerful psychological drivers shaping human behavior, and understanding why you should stop seeking validation requires a deep examination of identity, autonomy, cognitive bias, emotional regulation, and philosophical self-governance. From a Stoic perspective informed by thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, the desire for external approval represents a misplacement of value, because it locates the source of worth outside the only domain you truly control, your judgments, intentions, and voluntary actions, thereby creating a fragile psychological architecture dependent on fluctuating opinions. Social hierarchies and cultural norms are inherently unstable. When you seek validation, you unconsciously delegate authorship of your self-concept to other people, allowing their reactions to determine your internal equilibrium. And this delegation is costly because human evaluations are inconsistent, biased by projection, self-interest, mood, and incomplete information, meaning you are building your self-esteem on shifting sand rather than bedrock. And this instability generates chronic anxiety as you monitor facial expressions, response times, social media metrics, tone shifts, and micro-signals for reassurance, transforming everyday interactions into performance reviews rather than authentic exchanges. Psychologically, validation seeking often emerges from conditional acceptance in early development, where approval was contingent on achievement, compliance, attractiveness, or emotional suppression, teaching the nervous system that belonging must be earned rather than assumed. And while such adaptations may have been protective in formative environments, they become maladaptive in adulthood because they maintain hypervigilance and erode intrinsic motivation, leading you to prioritize impression management over genuine expression, which in turn fragments identity as you curate different versions of yourself for different audiences, losing coherence and experiencing the exhaustion of role switching. The Stoic dichotomy of control clarifies error here, because opinions of others fall squarely outside your direct control, and by investing emotional energy into influencing uncontrollable variables, you create a perpetual dissatisfaction loop where even praise fails to satisfy for long, since it must be renewed and confirmed repeatedly, producing dependency akin to intermittent reinforcement schedules studied in behavioral psychology, where unpredictable rewards strengthen attachment rather than stabilize it, meaning the more inconsistent validation you receive, the more compulsively you may seek it. Furthermore, external validation distorts decision-making by incentivizing short-term approval over long-term virtue, encouraging conformity to dominant narratives, risk aversion in creative pursuits, and silence in the face of disagreement, which undermines moral courage and intellectual independence, both central to Stoic ethics as articulated in texts such as Meditations, where the emphasis rests on aligning action with reasoned principle rather than public applause. And this misalignment produces cognitive dissonance, because your behavior no longer reflects your authentic convictions, but instead mirrors anticipated reactions, gradually eroding self-trust as you notice the gap between what you believe and what you perform. Self-trust is foundational to psychological resilience because it enables decisive action under uncertainty. And when validation becomes your compass, your direction fluctuates with social winds, making you reactive rather than deliberate, emotionally volatile rather than grounded, and overly sensitive to criticism, because critique threatens not just behavior, but your externally scaffolded identity. In addition, validation-seeking narrows perception by biasing attention toward cues related to approval and rejection, amplifying negativity bias and confirmation bias, as you selectively interpret ambiguous feedback as disapproval, reinforcing insecurity, which then drives further approval-seeking and compensatory cycle, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates self-doubt. Relationally, excessive validation-seeking places covert pressure on others because interactions become transactional. You offer likability, humor, competence, or agreement in exchange for reassurance, subtly burdening relationships with the expectation of emotional caretaking, which can breed resentment or attract partners and friends who exploit the dynamic, recognize your hunger for affirmation and leveraging it for influence, thereby compromising boundaries. By contrast, when you withdraw from the validation economy and cultivate internal standards, relationships become cleaner and more reciprocal, as you no longer require constant confirmation and can tolerate disagreement without interpreting it as existential threat, allowing authentic dialogue and mutual growth. From a performance standpoint, intrinsic motivation research consistently shows that autonomy, mastery, and purpose drive sustainable excellence more effectively than external praise, because intrinsic goals are self-endorsed and therefore resilient under criticism, whereas extrinsically motivated efforts collapse when applause fades, leading to burnout or abandonment of meaningful projects once they cease generating visible recognition. Stopping validation seeking does not mean becoming indifferent to feedback or socially isolated, but rather recalibrating the hierarchy of influence so that feedback informs behavior without dictating worth, enabling you to evaluate criticism through rational scrutiny instead of emotional reflex, accepting what is accurate and discarding what is projection, which requires emotional regulation skills such as cognitive reappraisal, mindfulness of bodily activation, and deliberate pause before response. Practice is compatible with Stoic negative visualization and reflective journaling. Philosophically, seeking validation conflates reputation with character, yet reputation exists in other minds and is therefore fragmented and uncontrollable, while character resides in your consistent exercise of chosen virtues. And as Seneca argued in his Moral Letters, tranquility arises when conscience, not crowd, becomes judge, because conscience can be examined and aligned, whereas see. If Part 1 exposed the psychological instability of building your identity on applause, then Part 2 must go deeper into the mechanics of detachment, because stopping validation seeking is not merely a conceptual shift, but a disciplined restructuring of cognition, behavior, and self-perception. And this restructuring becomes clearer when examined through the lens of Stoic moral psychology as articulated by Epictetus, who argued that disturbance arises not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them, meaning that when someone withholds approval or offers criticism, the suffering does not originate in their words, but in the interpretation that those words diminish our worth. Therefore, the operative variable is not social response, but evaluated belief. And if belief is trainable, then freedom is attainable, which implies that validation seeking persists because we have fused evaluation with identity, conflating they disapprove of my action with I am inadequate, a cognitive distortion that can be dismantled through deliberate separation of behavior from essence, recognizing that actions are adjustable variables, while worth is not a market commodity subject to bidding. This cognitive reframing aligns with insights found in Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, who repeatedly reminded himself that reputation exists only in the minds of others, and is therefore both fragmented and ephemeral, while virtue is enacted through choice and thus remains within sovereign control. And sovereignty is the operative word because validation seeking is fundamentally a sovereignty problem. When you crave approval, you are outsourcing governance of self-concept, allowing fluctuating social currents to dictate internal weather, whereas the Stoic project is meteorological independence, the cultivation of an internal climate system regulated by reason principle rather than applause. Yet achieving this independence requires confronting the withdrawal symptoms of approval. Addiction, because intermittent praise operates neurologically through dopaminergic reward circuits, similar to other reinforcement loops, and when supply diminishes, the psyche may experience agitation, self-doubt, or compulsive reassurance-seeking behaviors, such as over-explaining, people-pleasing, or monitoring digital metrics. So practical attachment must include tolerance training, intentionally resisting the urge to seek immediate reassurance, and allowing the discomfort of ambiguity to metabolize without reaction, thereby teaching the nervous system that lack of affirmation is not threat but neutrality. Over time, this exposure reduces reactivity, increasing emotional range and resilience. Additionally, you must conduct a values audit, because detachment without direction risks drifting into apathy, And the objective is not indifference to excellence, but redirection of evaluation criteria from external applause to internal coherence, which requires articulating operational definitions of your core virtues. What does integrity look like in your profession? What constitutes courage in your relationships? How do you define excellence independent recognition? And once defined, these standards become your performance metrics, transforming daily life into a practice arena for self-alignment rather than impression management. This shift has strategic implications in high-stakes environments, such as leadership, entrepreneurship, or creative production, where decisions often invite criticism, and those anchored in validation will hesitate, dilute vision, or pivot prematurely in response to noise, while those anchored in principle can absorb dissent without overcorrection, distinguishing between signal and static. Historically, Stoic teachers like Seneca emphasize that popularity is morally neutral and frequently inversely correlated with virtue, because crowds reward entertainment and conformity more reliably than disciplined integrity, meaning that if your compass is applause, you will drift toward what is easily celebrated rather than what is substantively valuable, which may offer slower or subtler returns. Beyond philosophy, contemporary motivational science reinforces this framework by demonstrating that intrinsic goals, mastery, autonomy, contribution, predict sustained well-being more robustly than extrinsic goals such as fame or image. And this empirical convergence suggests that detaching from validation is not ascetic denial, but performance optimization, preserving cognitive bandwidth otherwise consumed by